Hey, welcome. It's so great to see you here today, Becky Haas, and my co-founder of TANA, Mike Lizotte. Um, Becky is joining us today from Tennessee, from Johnson City, right?
Yeah.
That's correct.
It's for those of you who don't know, Becky Haas is an acclaimed international speaker and advocate trainer in trauma-informed communities. So there's a whole list of bio that we could go through, but for now, I'd really just love to hear from you, Becky, about your journey into this space, building a trauma-informed community. That's really what TANA is about. So we were absolutely delighted to find you already further along the path. So tell us a bit about how you got started in this.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Sue. And it's really great to join you and Mike today. And I've really enjoyed meeting some of your community partners and the visits that we've had. And, I'm a cheerleader of the work that you're doing at TANA because I see what's happening here in the United States and in my area, in Northeast Tennessee and in Southwest Virginia, by just raising awareness. I might not have been the most qualified person to do this, but I learned how to make a lot of noise because as a mother and a grandmother, while I was working for the Johnson City, Tennessee Police Department to reduce drug-related and violent crime, I heard about the cradle to prison pipeline. And I wondered, who are children that are born that have a predisposition that could head them to a life of incarceration? And it was in that context that I heard about the ACEs study. And I really felt like I was hearing the cure for cancer, and that if I didn't tell my community that, like, I would be held responsible. That's how urgent I felt about this message. And I definitely feel that urgency with the TANA team as well. And so at the time in 2014, the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA, they recommended in a concept paper to use a trauma-informed approach and to address the effects of trauma, childhood trauma, through an upstream approach of training and advocacy. And so I set out to train my TAM. And I partnered with a psychology professor at East Tennessee State University. We still had our day jobs. We had no income to do this. It wasn't in our job description. She and I both worked very hard on our regular jobs so that no one would feel we were slighting our job to give attention to this other. But that's how strongly we felt about it. I would come in at 6 a.m. to keep my 19 police programs running very well. We'd won national awards with those programs, and I didn't want the chief of police to ever feel disappointed. And then after we trained about 4,000 professionals in our small community, we reached out to SAMHSA and said, we'd sure like to meet other cities that are doing your concept paper. And that's when we found out something unusual happened here. And they wrote us back and they said, we don't know of a town, so we're going to come there and you tell your story. So they came in 2018, and two governors' wives came, people from 20 states, and we shared. We had people, a doctor, we had college faculty, we had librarians, we had foster care, we had people popping up on our schedule like popcorn, telling what they begin to do, librarians, when they had the lens, the trauma-informed lens on. And then 30 days after that, I was recruited to come to work for the largest healthcare system in our region. It covers 3 states with 22 hospitals, to be their first ever trauma-informed administrator. So in 4 years, with it not even being in our job description, we helped to raise awareness that childhood adversity without healthy support is a significant risk factor to later life disparities, including addiction.
Absolutely. Wow, it's beautiful. It's so beautiful to hear, and so many, you're triggering so many thoughts in me, but it's kind of like we've used the term, an idea whose time has come. And it's amazing how we've kind of received the same message. on the other side of the planet. And we looked at SAMHSA in the beginning as well. And yeah, the sense of urgency is a term that I've used from the beginning as well. For me, it stemmed from being in education and passionate about seeing that system change because childhood is so precious.
Mhm.
And it wasn't to the degree of understanding trauma, but it was that's really what motivated me to introduce Mike and Bridget and literally make time to go, what are we going to do? What can we do to shift this? It's such a complex problem. And then Bridget came to us with, complex trauma, Bessel van der Kolk's work, and then just went, she went deep into the science, which has been such a gift for us. But the idea that from really TANA was born similarly to you about the concept paper from SAMHSA, which we also had in our early startup. But Robert Ander, the work of, the
Mhm.
original ACEs study with Dr. Robert Ander and Vince Folletti, but someone had done a diagram that Robert Ander talked about the cogs, the different cogs, and the biggest, he's got an illustration of building self-healing communities.
Mhm.
And he had an illustration of the biggest wheel and the four smaller wheels being the justice system, the medical system, education, and social services. But the biggest wheel, which is the driving wheel in any system, is the population of people with ACEs.
Mm.
So we realise that we've got to get this to the grassroots. So a lot of service providers are talking about this, but how important do you think, and we'll talk about what you've done, but how important do you think it is that this becomes widespread at the grassroots level?
Mhm. That's a good question, Sue. And it's interesting. I love to hear you say grassroots because sometimes the traditional experts, though they're doing tremendous work, they didn't learn about this in college and universities. And so some of us, whether it's through a child with addiction or a brother with addiction or a neighbor or a church friend or whatever, we kind of, or our own trauma, we kind of come across this information like I did while reducing drug related and violent crime. And I felt like, have you ever worked a jigsaw puzzle? And it's a used puzzle. It's one that someone else in your home has used, and you get it all finished and there's a piece that was missing. And that's exactly what trauma informed care and ACEs, it was the one piece that was missing to keep the puzzle from coming together. And then one of the things that I saw, Sue, and Mike, in our community was I sat in governmental meetings. I heard how expensive it is to incarcerate someone for a day. I knew that prison population, the United States has 5% of the world population and 25% of world incarcerated population. And so I've known for 20 years incarceration population in America has grown by 500%. And I know my community or any other community that I work with or visit, that it has not reduced drug addiction. It hasn't even slowed it down. And so we're building these jails, and it's $80 a day in my town to be incarcerated for one day. And that's a very costly intervention that isn't fixing it. And then I saw about people living on the street as homeless, or people whose lifespan was being shortened because of teenage pregnancies or self-harm or other risky behaviors. And then I started hearing from, like, Lithuania, a university students. And if you Google what country has the highest rate of suicide, it's Lithuania. In 2013, one of every 3 people committed suicide, ended their life in Lithuania. The way they died was suicide. And these university students reached out and doing work in the UK, doing work with people in France. And so just like the world has just experienced the global trauma of the pandemic of COVID-19, now we're at a tremendous opportunity to raise awareness around the global pandemic of created trauma, of violence and abuse and neglect, and that we see it is a scientific upstream approach to facing these challenges that our traditional approaches are not conquering. I like a quote that says that if the electric light bulb was not invented by continuing to improve candles, that one day the candle shop maker had to say, you know what, I think we got candles as good as we're going to get them. But one day somebody had to look in a different direction. And I think the grassroots folks like TANA, like me, and like many others now, we're starting to say, you know what, I think we could create a light bulb. I think we could look in a new direction.
Mm, beautiful. I love that. Yeah, we're intent on leading this upstream approach from the grassroots. Mike, just before we go on, there's I know that we were introduced to you when Mike went to Tennessee. He found out about you doing this work and said, "There's two women in Tennessee who are like Sue and Bridget. They they're talking the same way, and they've actually created a trauma informed community." So just to give a picture, let's paint a picture of what does a trauma informed community look like. Mike, do you want to share your
Yeah,
experience?
well, having the opportunity to visit the Tennessee area, so folks can understand, I was very privileged to be able to sit in on in real time some of the things that were going on that Becky and Dr. Andy Clements had set up. One in particular was normal group meetings that were happening regularly. Before I go into that, I'd love to just ask Becky, what's that looking like now, those group meetings? Is someone else running them now? Or have they broken down to the small groups? Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, and that's something before I left the healthcare job. When I was in healthcare, it really took off more because that was my primary job as trauma-informed administrator. And now I had much larger boundaries than what I had working for police. My job at the police was by and large paid with tax money of the city of Johnson City. You know, that's the budget there. So I pretty much had to stay in that area. So it's amazing to me that we trained 4,000 professionals and I stayed in the circumference of the police, what the police served. So I'd really kind of probably reached a tipping point there. So it was perfect when the healthcare offered an opportunity, because now I had 2 states, I had a huge area. And so that really began to grow. And so then when I stepped into my world, my consulting role now, I met with Andy Clements and another lady that works for the Tennessee Commission, Jill Scott. You met her on your visit. She's what part of our coalition leader. And we met with 2 people in Bristol, Tennessee that were really doing very good work that had gotten its start after I went to Ballard, really took off. And so they're facilitating that regional conversation. A few other things that happened is one of the team members I worked with in healthcare was furloughed during COVID-19. And she was hired by a United Way in Southwest Virginia, and her primary role, and quite a bit of funding now they have, she's the resilience manager. And so, and then before I left the healthcare, they gave $1 million over 5 years to the East Tennessee State University, where Dr. Andy Clements works, and we started the Strong Brain Institute, of which she and I both are founding members. So it doesn't look the same, but it hasn't gone away. We've just got some new mechanisms that are driving it.
Right. Okay. In particular, the equine therapy group, and perhaps the after school play program that I was introduced to. Do you know of how they're going, and are they still upgrading their staff members to become trauma informed? And
the horse program, I have not been in touch with them. I'm working with another community in Middle Tennessee, and they have a strong presence of a horse therapy group that is in their coalition. Our after school program today, matter of fact, between training healthcare members in 4-hour sessions, I had a board meeting for the Boys and Girls Club, which I'm on the board there for many years. And that was the first organization. It's an after school at-risk program for kids. It's national. And we've known for a couple of decades that Boys and Girls Club makes a difference to kids' lives. But now we know why, because when they have instability at home or addiction at home or poverty, that stability of that club. And so that club has really done a tremendous job. They continue to train all the staff, all the volunteers. They lead tours through the building of big benefactors, Pepsi Cola, brick makers, people that want to be donors to the thing. And anyone that's a donor, whether you're a volunteer or you send a work party to paint rooms or whatever, they lead a tour and they tell them how they're trauma informed. They show them the calming room. And so I think where we're at in some things, Mike, is some groups are going deeper. One of my favorite quotes is that trauma informed is a process. It's a journey. It's not just, drive around, call in your order, run around, pick it up, and you're done. And so I think where some of the groups that were work I started, some are going much deeper. And now, like at that club, it's in their policies. They put it in the job description that we want people that know about trauma. And then if they hire them and they don't, then they get them right away in a training in their first few days of being there.
Lovely. It reminds me, after you just reiterated some of those things, you said a while ago, to be trauma informed, it's not taught, it's caught.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful thing.
Yeah. And people are learning that how to take it out of theory into practice. And, I want to encourage you and TANA that Dr. Clements and I, when we started giving out the trauma-informed lens to help people see, that sometimes someone's rude or maybe their physical ailments, drug addiction, maladaptive coping, that it's being driven by trauma. And but what we never could have contemplated is what people would do with it. And I cry many times when a new report comes to me, like a high school up in Marion, Virginia, that I began to work with when I was in healthcare. And the superintendent there is just fantastic. And he had me train all his principals, 17 schools, and we did a leadership retreat. He had the leaders pick out what kind of strategies they wanted to do. Then he had me train 700 teachers. Then I trained all the bus drivers, the custodians during COVID. And then just this year, I went back as a consultant and did their convocation with 600, 700 teachers. And now I get stories and photos where they have sensory hallways in the room in each school, and the young kids, they have calming spaces. And the high school students, typically where there's bullying, these high school students, when they learn that some of their classmates that come in not smelling good or having nice clothes or looking like they probably need a bath, instead of making fun of kids, these high school students asked for the principal to buy a washer and dryer, and they did. And they started a laundry program, and they have a program called Suds for Buds, where they actually give away deodorant and toothpaste and things that we may take for granted. And I see those things and get those stories, and it makes me cry, Mike. And Laura Porter says in the movie Resilience that if you give people the tools, they'll do wonderful things. And from just my time being with TANA, your visit here, Mike, I already know that. I know wonderful things are on the way.
Yes,
Thank you so much. I got goosebumps with that too. That's beautiful. And I love the innovation. And a question came to mind, which you may have already answered, but when you spoke about the Boys and Girls Club and, the kids learning, and you mentioned it with the high school kids, but are the kids teaching their parents? Like, is this coming from, as children learn and understand this, do you see them teaching the adults?
In some cases, I've really never told an organization how to disseminate it.
Yeah.
As far as their framework, I leave it up to them. And so in the Boys and Girls Club, they have very much interaction with the parents. And sometimes they'll know when a family's struggling to pay rent or maybe can't buy coats in the winter, that kind of thing. So they have a pretty good connection to the families. So sometimes they've created family engagement opportunities where the staff. This past year as a board member, I went and did a couple of nights and talked to parents about ACEs. So sometimes it can come from, different ways. But like Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris says, who's now the Surgeon General of the large state, California, and doing beautiful work in that state around ACEs. But when she was a pediatrician in San Francisco, she said, if you think about ACEs like lead poisoning, that I could use my medical practice to help people get better from lead poisoning, or live with the symptoms, or do the best they could, or I could go to the house and find the source of the lead. And so it's really only a win-win situation if we can strengthen our families too, because the healthy support to kids and organizations is good. But if we can strengthen our families too, with job fairs, job skill training, health clinics, things that are readily available, it's going to create resilient communities.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, Mike.
It just brings to mind the strengthening all sorts of areas of our community, and it brings to mind a strengthening the faith-based communities here in Tasmania. In particular, this area, I just got a beautiful story where a woman here is getting responded to. Her power got turned off yesterday, and massive bill that she got let get behind. And without notice, they just turned the power off. And now the church is behind her on that. But this church is, I know full well that they're trauma informed. They totally understand it. So they start from a clean slate. They don't think this woman made poor choices. No, they think, no, this woman has been struggling for whatever reason. We don't need to know that. Let's get in and let's respond in a trauma informed way. And I won't go into the details, but these are the areas where, the churches are already in the grassroots situation. If we have our faith-based communities on fire in terms of understanding with this trauma-informed lens, the power in that is immediate. It's immediate. You don't have to go through service providers. It's there. You've already got relationships happening. So I would love you to comment on your journey. We know you're a pastor of a church. We love the fact that your faith and your work is so integrated. Can you explain how that works in your life and how that, how that plays out?
Well, sure. I worked in the church that I attend for 40 some years. I worked on the staff. We actually have pastors. They're dear friends of mine. So I was just an associate, staff member, but I am an ordained minister. And I think one of the things that it really drew me to this message, because in my faith, I realized that the message, particularly of Christianity, is lifting up people that are broken. That when I was broken, putting us back together. But I also was so surprised to learn that some people, the trauma they experienced was in the faith community. That at a vulnerable time in life, when they sought out a house of faith, that spiritual authority in some way, there was abuse. And so we began training faith community here. Dr. Clements has really gone on to do some work with Duke University and medicine and religion, bringing the two together. We have some wonderful organizations in the state of Tennessee that realized a few years ago that there were 12,000 churches in Tennessee, and that here was the greatest untapped resource that could be brought into recovery, brought into homelessness and all. So they began to bring in and train the faith community and all. But so even Sunday in my own church, we had it was a whole service around stories, and we had about 6 youngish people sharing their stories, and every single one of them began with some kind of, my mother died when I was 18 months old. My mother was a meth addict, and this particular girl just graduated from this college of pharmacy as a pharmacist. And she said that her brother, younger brother and sister, the mother was kind to them, but she always took out everything on her as an older, told her she was ugly. She beat her black and blue. She'd wear long sleeves to school. One day she had her in the corner and threw hot soup on her. And this young woman said how mad she was at God. But one day, after doing drugs and going down a lot of wrong paths, and she was with some friends that just shared with her. And now through her own personal relationship with the Lord, she came off of drugs. She's in college. She's now a pharmacist. And so we think about the metaphor of charging station with trauma. Resilience is charging our batteries. And though it may be a supportive relationship, it may be a friend, it may be a workout, a yoga, a hike in the mountains, but to many, it could be faith, as it was for this young woman. So I think we should not build communities and leave any demographic out, the justice or the judges or the healthcare or the faith community. We need to have everybody at the table.
Yeah, fantastic. We want to make complex trauma common knowledge is one of
Yes.
our mission statement.
Yes.
I just wanted to ask something that there's a lot of belief. We don't actually adhere to this because it hasn't been our experience, but there are some people who seem to be wary of entering that space of talking about, child abuse, for example, with parents. There are some people in the services who have a fear that it could be triggering. In fact, at our big community forum in January 2019, someone from the education department came up in quite a state to tell us that we can't talk about this because people will get triggered. Um, this idea that entering the family space, that we've got all these services, and I find that in our policies at the moment here as well, a lot of talk about all of the treatment, and now we're going back into the 0 to 4, and we're talking about the importance of those first 1,000 days. But I haven't really heard anybody talk about addressing parents, and that's something we would love to do, because we feel that it's just something that can be shared with an open heart, not with judgment. And it's just so important. And what we find is it's kind of an overwhelming sense of relief and release that people experience when, especially if they've suffered, to realize it's not that there's something wrong with me, it's what happened to me. It's not, and I'm not alone. So, what would you say to that, to those people who are afraid of this taboo subject of that the family is sacred and we shouldn't enter that space?
And that good question, Sue. Well, I think one thing is to understand, and when I've made some presentations there to TANA, you sent me some of your local data. And when I do presentations in the US, I get the data, and we can see that it's not a small number of people that live in our community that are trauma survivors. It's really like 70% globally of people that have experienced some trauma. And so we really want to promote a universal precaution method. We may do screening. It's really not about knowing the story. It's about helping a community help people deal with the lingering effects of the trauma, whether it's you can't hold a job or you're struggling with addiction. Think about the young girl born to the mom with the meth addict having the soup thrown on her. Well, if she'd have followed in her footsteps and gone on to drugs and crime, so she would have really been born punished, and now she's going to go through life being punished. And not that there's not consequences for the drugs or the crime, but maybe in that prison should be a healing group like some prisons do now, to talk about trauma, where people are videos are crying saying it was the best day of my life to find out I wasn't born a bad person. So really this focus is not about knowing the story, Sue, or asking people the stories, but it's more about helping people to know how to deal with the lingering effects. And if you go back to the original ACEs study, that before, when Dr. Anda and Folletti wrote the protocol and they presented it to the institutional review board that makes sure that human subject safety research is done around protocol, that back in that day in the late 90s didn't have cell phones, but they said, if you're going to talk about this kind of stuff with people in a healthcare plan, you have to have a counselor wear a pager 24/7. So if anyone is triggered in you questioning them about their childhood adversity, they can call a counselor. And in 17,337 people, no one ever called the counselor. You know why? Because it's a healing message. It's a healing message, and people are resilient. They're very brave survivors among us. And so really it's a championing message. And we just treat our classrooms with universal precaution. The healthcare system that I'm training as of even today, we're talking about when you go in an exam room, think about that 70% of a chance you could have a rape survivor there or domestic violence. So now you're going to say, take off your clothes, turn off the lights. Well, do you need to reframe that to someone who's a trauma survivor? Could we say, my assistant will be here. Would you like a blanket? We're going to turn off the lights. Tell me when you're ready to step in. So it's not that hard, Sue. It's just being mindful of how to have environments that really help our services be more effective.
Yeah, absolutely. There's certainly been times in my work as an educator where we've just sort of gone, what did I say that child just had that reaction, that we,
Yeah.
in those days.
Yeah.
I just have to comment too on the poetry of this girl that you've described, whose mother was a meth addict and she's gone on to graduate from pharmacy. To me, that's like the polar, she's gone into the same field, but
Mm-hmm.
for good,
Oh, yeah.
in the light rather than
Yeah.
the dark. She's found a way, that to understand. She's maybe wanted a deeper understanding of drugs, but it's just such a great illustration of her experience, turning her experiences around, and almost
Yeah.
using her experience to move herself in a completely different direction. So yeah,
And often I was speaking at a social work conference, and they told us statistics of how many people go into a social work or a compassionate profession because of bad experiences that they grew up in, and they want to make a difference. And I was amazed at the amount of people that go into a compassion profession to make a difference, like what you're just saying for her, what she was concerned, because that was not her experience.
yeah, I do think I've thought about that. I think most of us find our life's purpose work in something that we wish we'd had. I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
that's been my observation. I know that we haven't got a lot of time, and there's so many thoughts have been triggered while you're speaking. But I did want to ask you particularly. So we, as TANA, we've always talked about a top down, bottom up approach. Like we've understood through the research that that's really what's required. I mean, social cultural change is in some people's minds impossible, but we're giving it a go anyway. So we've talked a lot about the grassroots. Have you had an opportunity to work with policymakers, and what degree of importance would you place on our political leaders being trauma informed? How does that impact the process?
Well, again, good questions. You all are have some good thoughts to bring out today. Yes, policymakers cannot be ignored because number one, because of the local policies or the state policies, the federal policies, we need to, in the United States in the 90s, in the 1990s, there was sweeping reform around the Federal Disabilities Act, which was policy from legislators that made all sidewalks have to have a handicap accessible ramp, and all bathroom signs in a public building have to be in Braille. In other words, that everything had to be fully accessible to anyone that might have a physical disability, and a broad sweeping reform, and that came through policy, and funding to help make it happen. And so here in my area, I reach out to the policymakers. And in 2017, we had a longtime senator in our area, Senator Lamar Alexander, and he headed a committee in the federal government that was over health and education, welfare. And they were working on an opioid crisis bill. I believe some cities had begun to sue bring out litigation against the makers users of the opioid drugs, that kind of stuff. So there was opioid crisis bill being drafted. And I reached out to his office and his field director. We had coffee for an hour and a half one day at Starbucks. And she came to a training not long after that. And then after that, she became a real champion. And then when the senator was, his policy writers in Washington were working on that bill for the president, she had them contact. She set them up a call with me. And I sent them Dr. Folletti's article about it's not the addiction, it's the trauma. And some of the language of that made it into the opioid crisis bill that our president signed. And then unfortunately, a few years later, he decided not to run for re-election. And now we have to do the same with the new people. So I've had coffee with both of their field representatives, and you just stay at it, and again, the urgency, as you all I know have, knowing you and Mike and Bridget, so a few years ago on our news one night, there gave a report in Tennessee of a terrible car crash, and there had been 26 vehicles in the crash, tractor trailers, cars, and it was a fiery crash. And on the news, they were interviewing a young man, a Good Samaritan, first into the crash that was not involved in the crash. And he came upon this horrific scene. And before the responders got there, he's running from car to car to car to pull people out of burning vehicles. And you know what, Sue? No one in those vehicles said, wait a minute, we're waiting on the fire department, or we're waiting. No, they just appreciated that. And so when we think about building resilient communities, we have to involve our policymakers. We have to involve our churches. We have to involve, because those can be the rescuers. They can be a part of the link of bringing the rescue. And I really feel in the next 5-10 years, England has a very robust program called 70-30 to reduce childhood trauma of 70% by the year 2030. So I think more and more that this is really here to stay, and we're going to begin to see some sweeping change.
Yeah, absolutely. We will reach a tipping point. We will.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it is just about starting the conversation. Mike, I just wanted to check in with you before, just if there's nothing pressing, but yeah, I just paused there for a moment to let Mike have a word. Yeah.
I guess what comes to mind, with you sense that Bridget, Sue, and I have a degree of urgency. I think once I saw the Nadine Burke-Harris 17-minute TED Talk many years ago now, that urgency has never left me, and I know Sue and Bridget found their own. They have their own way of a story about how their urgency has come about. But I guess that urgency, it concerns me because we put it onto other supporters that we have, our committee members, and we are at a stage where we are excited, but we go where no one has gone before, and so I just want to know what sort of advice you would give us in terms of keeping ourselves safe, keeping supporters, because everyone that gets behind TANA now we find, but they just want to go tell someone. Is there anything that we should know in part to us in terms of going forward with that in mind?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's really critical that you keep your batteries charged up, so to speak. And so I think by joining networking, which I know you all have created some wonderful network. I've had a privilege to meet a few online. And those always, to me, in my journey, they feel like a family reunion, that you need to be around people that speak French, that speak ACEs, that speak resilience. And you get in a room, and whether you got a teacher or you got the headmaster of the school, people at all different layers. And then when you're together, then you begin to share these inspirational stories, and we begin to see the things that are doing, and it keeps us encouraged. It keeps the fires burning, so to speak. And you know what? People sometimes write grants here in America and get discouraged because you can't get an appointment with the leader of the school. They can't get the mayor. They can't get the police chief. I say, wait a minute, start the fires outside the camp and just keep them burning, and you'll get in 20 teachers. And next thing, they bring their principal. And then next thing, the principal at a principal's meeting tells the superintendent, we need you there. And then some of them may hear from people above them. But you know what? We just need to not give up. We need to think there's no more generations of children that should be sacrificed when we know good and well what is going to happen without healthy support. And, you know, that's the way that I live every day. You know, my husband and I ride bikes, and we're one little park we ride through. There's a bunch of kids, teens that hang out, and it's kind of skaters in the hoodies. And he knows in that community a lot of drug. And well, sometimes we'll see a car pull up and a girl jump in, prostitution. And my husband's like, honey, start a group, start a group. And I said, you're retired, you start a group. And you know, because we're seeing that this is making a difference. So I think the networking y'all are doing a great job at. Keep it up, and you're going to stay encouraged, and this work's only going to grow.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. That's it really is about the more people that know, you know, having the kids talk among themselves, having that
Yeah.
conversation, making it common knowledge. So thank you so much for your time today, Becky. There's so much more we could talk about. So maybe we'll do this again sometime.
Do it again. You know how to find me.
I'd
And
love-
I feel like we're just having coffee together. I really feel connected at the heart to you all and to TANA, and just am cheering you on in all sincerity in the work that you're doing and being a champion there. And thank you for the opportunity to share a little bit here today. And sure, we'll do it again.
Fantastic. Your work lends strength to ours. So thanks again.
Good.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Okay, you all as well. Hope to
God
see you
bless you.
soon.
Thanks,
Bye.
Becky.
Bye-bye.